Welcome to Transylvania! I keep gagging on my teeth. Let's see how long I can keep them in for. These are the lengths I go to for a fun YouTube video on drooling. Honestly, I wouldn't do all of this without my Patreon. So if you like the fact that I do this, please support me on Patreon so I can spend money on this. It's really fun.
Today I'm going to talk about some vampire books. If you didn't hear anything that I just said, please support me on Patreon. My eyes are watering. So I read and reread a whole bunch of vampire books over the last few weeks, and I want to talk about them. Happy Halloween! This is Dracula. Don't know if you've heard of it. It was written by Bram Stoker in the late 19th century. Dracula was not the first vampire book, but it is the one that we all think of, for good reason. It's really, really good. It is one of my favourite gothic novels. It's a big, chunky thing. Takes a good while to read, and it's also an epistolary novel. It's written entirely as a series of letters, journals, diary entries. Is there a difference between a diary and a journal? And also newspaper clippings and ads and stuff like that. It's all epistolary and it's gorgeous. It's wonderfully over the top and campy in its language and its events. It is a truly exciting, romantic, gothic adventure story featuring one of the great villains of fiction ever, Count Dracula. The characters within Dracula have become legendary in their own right, especially Van Helsing. There are some great movie adaptations, especially the one by Francis Ford Coppola. That's a great film, with Gary Oldman just chewing the scenery as Dracula. If you've never read this novel, and you thought, maybe it's a bit dry, maybe it's a bit old, maybe it hasn't aged very well, no. Dracula is so much fun. It's wonderfully atmospheric, it's gory, it's gothic, it's sexy. It highlights the fact that vampires are gay as hell. It's absolutely wonderful. If you've never read Dracula, please read it. And also get a copy like mine, because this is stunning. The sprayed edges are grey. Love this book. Next up is Twilight. I recently read Twilight, kinda, for my 20,000 subscribers special thing, and I didn't finish it. I read 100 out of 400 pages and I got bored. The thing about Twilight is that it's quite boring. I really didn't expect that. I thought I was going to have fun ripping it apart, talking about how cringe and awkward and toxic it all is, but I was just kind of bored. The writing is serviceable, the characters are not as bland and boring as they are in the films, but also not interesting either, and not much happens. I really don't get why this was such a phenomenon, honestly. I am not a teenage girl. I should have been, but I wasn't. And I don't really get it, but it's a phenomenon. It revitalized vampires in a lot of ways for a lot of people. It did a lot of good for the YA genre, and it's the reason we have so many great readers today, I think, and probably a lot of writers too. You cannot ignore the impact that this had on the literary community, on young people in general. Twilight is an incredibly impactful book, and for that reason, I guess it's worth reading, and I did try. And I'm putting it on this list because it's Twilight. You can't make a vampire list without mentioning Twilight, so here's Twilight. I'm also going to address the elephant in the room right now, which is that I still haven't read any Anne Rice books. I really wanted to read Interview with the Vampire before I did this video, but I didn't have time. I have seen the original film, though. And I loved that film. I loved it to death. The one where Kirsten Dunst is a little girl, I thought that film was brilliant. And apparently there's a brand new TV show set in New Orleans as well, which I need to check out. I really will read it soon, I promise. Maybe I'll do a video when I finally do. Here's Anno Dracula by Kim Newman. This is the first in a long series of books. I thought this book was incredible. I was really surprised by it. I thought I was going to go into something campy and schlocky and silly, kind of like a B-movie, a little bit awkward. No, this is a very politically savvy book. It's very clever. It's gorgeously written, and it's set in a kind of alternate timeline. It's basically a piece of Dracula fan fiction. It imagines a world where the novel Dracula actually exists in this world, but it didn't end the way that it really did in the world of Anno Dracula. What really happened is that Dracula killed almost everyone in the party of the original novel, and then moved to the UK turned Queen Victoria into a vampire, married her, became her prince, and is slowly turning the entire country into a kind of fascistic vampire state. It is a wonderful satire of Victorian London. It's a satire of Victorian politics, and it's generally a political satire. It looks at fascism and how it creeps in. It looks at the concept of a police state. It looks at corruption from different angles, corruption of the government, the police, the media. And it's also a really, really fun tale that includes a lot of references to real-world and fictional people from this era. So in this book, you have Bram Stoker. You also have Oscar Wilde. And you also have fictional characters like Sherlock and Mycroft Holmes, Dr. Jekyll, and others. It's really smart. And Jack the Ripper is kind of the main focus. You've got a vampire and a human who are each following in the footsteps of Jack the Ripper, trying to figure out what the hell he's up to and why. And the prostitutes that he's killing are all vampires. This is really fun. Like, please check out Anno Dracula if you haven't. It's a wildly fun book. Next up is this massive bastard. What's it called again? Empire of the Vampire. I did a video on this recently. I didn't finish it. I did not finish Empire of the Vampire. It's over 700 pages long, and I read about 250 pages, and I kind of had enough. But I do think it's a really great book. As I said in that video, which you can go watch, Empire of the Vampire is dreadful. But the dreadful bits are exactly as fun as the good bits. There are a few really good aspects to this novel that are worth checking out, but it's mostly terrible. But the terrible stuff is so much fun that it's worth reading, if you've got the time for it, because it's overly long. It's set in a fantastical world where everybody is kind of French-ish and says we instead of yes. It's very, very surface level gothic in terms of its atmosphere and its setting and its characters. And our protagonist is a 35-year-old man who has been hunting vampires in a world where vampires have pretty much taken over. One day, the sun just stopped rising. Oh, did you hear my stomach rumble? I must be thirsty for blood. Doesn't work without the teeth. Oh, my leg clicked. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, one day the sun didn't rise, and there are vampires, and they've been living out in the hills and caves and away from humanity, but now, because the sun hasn't risen, they get to just come out and play and build an empire and sack villages and take over. And there is a group of half-vampire people who are born of a human woman and a vampire man, and they just happen to exist sometimes. They are sometimes born. Our protagonist is one of them, and they are kind of a cult of vampire killers, and he's one of them, and he goes off hunting vampires, and you follow his story. And he is a ridiculous male power fantasy. He is cringe and awkward, and he swears too much in the worst possible moments. He has no sense of timing. He's awful. He's a dreadful, dreadful protagonist. But I love this book to bits. If you haven't read Empire of the Vampire and you can stand something stupid, overly masculine, really, really cringe, but just oodles of gothic vampire fantasy fun, you're going to enjoy this book. I also read a really good manga recently, a vampire manga called Call of the Night, which is kind of an inversion of Twilight. I read it on my Kobo, so I don't have it. But it tells the story of a young, depressed teenager in modern-day Tokyo. He's sad, and his depression has caused insomnia. So he goes out and he wanders the streets at night just for something to do, and he bumps into a vampire girl. And she's a little bit weirdly sexualized, but it does the manga thing where like, oh, it's okay because she's like 200 years old. It's not okay, it's disgusting, don't do it. But she's a really, really fun character nonetheless. And she likes to play with him. And then she drinks a bit of his blood and finds out, oh, he's really particularly tasty. And he asks her to turn him into a vampire, and she says, no, I'm not going to do that. And it turns out it's because you have to fall in love with the vampire. This is the inversion of Twilight thing. So it's kind of a will they, won't they situation. And if they will, if he manages to fall in love with her, he gets to turn into a vampire. But a lot of the manga is just shenanigans. It's just the two of them hanging out and getting to know each other, and other stuff happens. And it's sweet. It's sometimes wholesome, sometimes very much not. Kind of campy, kind of goofy, kind of funny. And I enjoyed it. Here is one of my prized possessions. This is a comic book that I tracked down like 10 years ago. It's out of print. This is from, I don't know, the 80s maybe? and it's gorgeous, and it's really tiny as well. And I did not reread it, so I can't remember anything that's in it. But it's a crossover between Batman and Dracula. That's why it's called Batman and Dracula. Red Rain, that's it. I think there's 3 of them, and this is the first in a trilogy. But it's by Doug Mensch, who's was a really great comic book writer. I remember distinctly when I was a very depressed high school teacher coming home, this package had arrived, and I sat down and read it, and it just brought me so much joy. Campy, silly fun. I loved Batman comics to death. I have read more Batman comics than I think I've read anything else in my life, but not for quite a few years now. And this was just an incredible amount of fun. It's beautifully drawn. Who's the artist? Kelly Jones. Kelly Jones did such an amazing job. Look at this. Gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Look at that. Bloody hell. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. That's brilliant. Gorgeous. Amazing. If you can get a copy of this, oh, absolutely well worth it. This is a lot of fun. It's part of the Elseworlds series, which was a series of kind of reimaginings of characters, where it's not canon. It's not part of the Batman canon. It's just a fun alternate timeline, imagine if this happened, sort of what-if scenario. Really, really fun stuff. Speaking of Batman, I got kind of sad because I was just looking through my comic bookshelves and I couldn't find American Vampire. So I must have sold it or given it to someone at some point. But American Vampire is a really good series of comics written by Scott Snyder, who wrote, in my opinion, the best Batman series ever. He was the great Batman writer, and he recently stopped writing Batman. But his American Vampire is a fantastic saga. It begins in the Wild West and slowly moves through the 20th century, and we follow a vampire anti-hero called Skinner Sweet. And he does some incredible things through his time, but it's a piece of Americana. We begin in a cowboy setting with him being an outlaw in the Wild West. Then we move into a Hollywood setting, the golden age of Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s. Then we move into World War II and even into the space race. There's some wild stuff in here, and all the while we're following this vampire anti-hero with the best name ever, Skinner Sweet. Scott Snyder's imagination is amazing. It's drawn by Raphael Albuquerque, who always does amazing stuff for DC Comics. They are a great team to pair up and write this. And the first few issues were also co-written by Stephen King. So even though for some reason I don't have it anymore, I highly recommend reading American Vampire. It is gorgeous, fun, frantic, and brilliant dedication to Americana and 20th century golden age USA and all of the glitz and glamour and grossness that comes with it. And finally, I want to mention Nosfor-A2. Nosfor-A2? Again, don't have it, I read it on my Kindle, and it's a novel by Joe Hill, Stephen King's son. Joe Hill is an incredible writer in his own right. He's written comics, novels, short story collections. His stuff has been adapted into TV. He's great. And Nosfor-A2 is my favorite thing he's written. It's a fantastic, like 600-ish page vampire rewritten saga thing. It's kind of a new take on the vampire. This creepy man who is abducting children, and we begin with a young girl who has a weird power where if she rides her bicycle over this covered bridge, she's able to transport herself to a lost thing, and she ends up in a library and she chats with this librarian who also has her own strange powers, and eventually all of this leads them to this strange man called Charlie Manx, who is stealing children, and he's a kind of modern take on the vampire. It's something pretty original and wonderful. Oh my god, I didn't mention the thing. I Am Legend. Oh my god. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Okay, a lot of people watched I Am Legend the film. Ignore that. Read I Am Legend the novel. I Am Legend is a fantastic twist on the vampire mythology. I read it like 12 years ago, but I still remember it very well. It's about a man who lives in a world of vampires, and as far as he knows, he's the only one left. He lives in a small town in California. He holes up in his house. He meets a dog at one point. Obviously, you'll remember the dog from the film. And the idea is that this man, this one man who is left, is hunted by vampires, but also feared by them, because vampires have become the norm. They are society now. and he is the vampire. That's the title of the book. I am legend. He has become legend. When vampire society has become normalized, the one human left, the guy with the shotgun, the guy with the wooden stakes, he's the vampire now. And I think it's a really, really clever novel. It was written back in the 50s or 60s, and I think it holds up brilliantly. It's a great novel. Please check it out. I think I'll stop there with that one. I'll leave you with I Am Legend, because that's a vampire book people don't talk about enough. And yes, I will also read a bunch of Anne Rice stuff soon, at least Interview with the Vampire. That'll happen soon. I hope you enjoyed this, because it was all quite ridiculous. Once again, support me on Patreon if you want me to do this more, because this is great. This is wonderful. I didn't do a very good job of it, but I had fun, and I hope you had fun too. Subscribe for books.